International Relations with Olena Palko's presentation at University of Basel. Unfortunately, she couldn't come in person, but she will be presenting her paper by Zoom. Olena, over to you.
Can I just double check that, well, I can see that you can see I'll just check that, sorry, just 1 second. But just 1 sec. All right, you can see the slides, right? But are they full screen or it's fine as it is? Well, yeah, I hope that you can see the slides and they are fine. So thank you for the invitation, and I really regret not being able to join you all in person. And I've learned a lot during these 2 days, especially since, same as Matt Polly, I'm an interloper in the Holodomor studies. My current research is on the minority aspect of the Soviet Korenizatsiya policy as implemented in Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s. And the Holodomor has never been a focus of my study. However, some of my findings could help understand the experiences of the Polish community in Ukraine in the early 1930s and provide useful background for the presentations of my most esteemed co-panelists who know so much more about the topic. So let me turn to the presentation. In his article published in Europe-Asia Studies back in 2009, David Marples stated that the academic debate in the West tends to focus on the 1932-33 famine as an all-Union phenomena, disregarding its ethnic perspective. By suggesting turning the scholarly attention to the ethnic issue, the Canadian historian offered to look at this event
Olena,
as a Ukrainian famine. Yes.
Can you start the PowerPoint slides, because they're just very small on the screen. If you start your presentation, they should come through.
All right, sorry. Can you see like this?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, the problem is that then I don't see my text. Maybe then I just don't have the slides. Sorry. Yeah, maybe I'll just don't have the slides then. Sorry then, I wasn't sure how it works. So then I don't have slides. Just a second. Okay. Yeah, so I'm sorry for the technical issues. I'm not really aware how to have a text and the slides at the same time. So perhaps then there will be no slide share. So let me continue then. So by suggesting turning the scholarly attention to the ethnic issue, the Canadian historian offered to look at this event as a Ukrainian famine. Most recently, Anne Applebaum, in her prize-winning book, called the famine the Stalin's war on Ukraine, whereby the Moscow leadership set out to destroy the Ukrainian peasantry. This perspective corresponds to the official narrative of independent Ukraine that lobbies for recognizing the famine of 1932-33 as a deliberate act of genocide against Ukrainians, as seen by the Parliament of Ukraine decree from 28 November 2006. In my presentation today, by no means I intend to refute the statement that the Holodomor was a man-made famine organized to break at the passive resistance of the Ukrainian peasantry. Instead, the aim of this talk is to enhance our understanding of this tragedy by looking at it through the ethnic lens. That is to explore the experiences of various non-Ukrainian victims of the famine, whose fate has for long been ignored in the historiography. In the end, according to the 1926 Soviet census, 20% of Ukraine's population belonged to minorities, and most of them were equally exposed to Moscow adverse policies. Due to my own specialism, I will concentrate on the Polish experiences during the collectivization and the Holodomor. In interwar Soviet Ukraine, Poles constituted the largest after Russians and Jews minority community. Actually, Ukraine was home for almost half of the Soviet Union's Polish population. Most Poles lived compactly in Ukraine's western provinces of Volhynia, Podolia, and Kyiv. The majority of the Polish population were peasants and lived in the countryside or small towns. During the 1920s, Soviet Poles, like any other minority group, became the target of the Soviet nationality policies, aimed to integrate them into the Soviet system and make them part of the Soviet whole. Already since the early 1920s, ethnic Poles were subjected to the new administrative policy, according to which each national minority was provided with the possibility of self-rule within a linguistically homogeneous national territory, which extended all the way from collective farms in village Soviets to separate autonomous national districts. By 1929, 150 Polish national village Soviets were created across Ukraine. In 1925, the first and only Polish national region in Soviet Ukraine was established in the Volhynia province, some 120 kilometers east from the Polish border. The Marchlewsk Polish district occupied an area of 650 square kilometers with 42,000 inhabitants, out of which 69% were recorded as Poles. Those national regions were to become Soviet strongholds on the ground, bringing diverse minorities towards communism. Poles were also to join the Soviet collectivization effort, the policy that entailed forming collective farms or kolkhoz, also along the ethnic lines, and political repression of prosperous peasants or kulaks. According to the Cracow KPB directive from 5th January 1930, the total collectivization of Soviet Ukraine was to be achieved by the spring of 1932. Instead, the Ukrainian party leadership, represented by Stanislav Kosior, declared that the republic would be collectivized already by the end of 1930. In this strive to accelerate collectivization, Ukraine's minorities could not be ignored. The Central Commission for National Minority Affairs was the main governmental body behind conceiving and implemented state programs among the minority populations. Already in August 1929, the Commission approved the collectivization policy and undertook to collectivize all minority population by the end of 1930. But first, the authorities needed to have a clear picture of the situation on the ground. Already in 1928, an inspection of all national regions was conducted. Poles proved to be the biggest cause for concern. They remained alienated from the Soviet regime and were among the least engaged minority groups within the state-building processes. In the Volhynia province, where most Poles resided, independent farmers and peasants in isolated homesteads or hutir continuously avoided joining the kolkhoz system. The inspection demonstrated different levels of collectivizations among the minority population, ranged from 4% for Poles to 79.6% for Greeks. In late 1930, it was clear, however, that the total collectivization was under threat. While at all Republican collectivization rate looked quite promising, it increased from 16.4% on the 1st of January to 68.5% on the 1st of March, and finally 70.3% on 10 August 1930. The collectivization among the minority population left much to be desired. The launch of collectivization campaign was met with overwhelmingly negative response. In February 1930, a mass uprising against collectivization broke out. The strongest resistance to the collective farm system was in Ukraine's border regions. For example, during February-March 1930, uprising spread to 63% of localities in the Shepetivka region. The situation was so dire that the state political department had Dmytro Balitsky arrived in Shepetivka to lead the fight against the rebels. Although these uprisings involved mostly Ukrainian peasants, Poles who lived there also participated. In addition, peasants' resignation from kolkhoz became a widespread phenomenon. For instance, the number of kolkhoz in the Volhynia region in 1930 decreased by 15%, and the number of collective farm members dropped 2 to 3-fold. In the eyes of the authorities, the failure of collectivization, as well as mass peasant uprisings, was linked to the joint effort of Catholic priests that for long had been distrusted by the authorities as Polish spies, and rich peasants, or kurkul, and so-called kurkulsko-clerikalna jedność. The Soviet authorities responded with political repression against those uncooperative elements. Each region received its own quotas for the kulakization. When there were not enough kulaks to fill in the plan, kulaks, I mean, like in the Soviet terminology, other individual farmers were targeted, for which even a new statistical category has been introduced, lower kulaks, or pitkurkulniki, a peasant that acts on behalf of the kurkul. Although collectivization directed mainly against so-called rich peasants and individual farmer was not supposed to have an ethnic dimension, in practice it quickly developed one. In the early 1930s, class and ethnicity, two categories that came to underpin the Soviet state and its ideology, concurred. Poles, as well as Germans and Jews, were perceived as being well-off kulaks by nature in the parlance of the time. As a result, in connection to those uprisings, Poles were frequently arrested and marked for deportation regardless of their socioeconomic status. As reported in November 1929, within 54 Polish village Soviets in the Volhynia Okrug, 1,228 households were dekolokized, 520 of which were in the Marchlewsk Polish district. Furthermore, in January 1930, the Szepetівka Regional Party Office signed off the deportation of 800 Kurkul families from the areas with predominant Polish population, such as Labuń, Poninka, Velika Berezna, and Pluzhne. And one of those families was actually the family of my great-grandfather, who was sent to Archangel. In total, 472 people were arrested. By March, the number of those arrested in connection to peasant uprisings grew to 2,000. Collectivization initiated mass immigration movement among almost all of the Soviet Union's Western national minorities. The first ones were Germans that already in September 1929 traveled to Moscow to demand exit visas to leave for Germany. Foreign correspondents arrived and provided the sensational coverage of the repression against ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, leading to thousands of Germans being allowed to leave. Poles also started petitioning the Soviet authorities and Polish consulates for their right to leave the Soviet Union. It should be said that the most persistent solicitors sent their demands to emigrate to their fatherland directly to the All-Union Council of People's Commissars and the Polish consulates in Moscow, rather than the Republican organs. When rejected, many engaged in mass demonstrations to the border, demanding the right to emigrate. For collectivization to succeed, more actions needed to be taken on the ground. Party activists and propaganda agents were sent to the Polish villages to observe the process of collectivization. Nonetheless, the collectivization rate among Ukraine's Poles remained low. According to an inspection of the Republic's national regions carried out in March 1931, the Polish national region lagged far behind other national districts and had the lowest rate of collectivization, some 16.8% against, of course, 4% 3 years ago, with only 1.8% annual increase during the 1920s, against the average rate of 58.8%. It is interesting to compare those showings of the Polish region with those of the neighboring Polynesia German national district, where the collectivization rate under the same natural and climatic conditions was twice higher, 32.4% of collectivized households. However, when the plan for grain procurement is concerned, the Marchlewsk region exceeded the compulsory grain procurement quota and delivered 103.7%, while Polynesia German region delivered only 77.5% of the plan. Similar shortcomings were recorded in January 1932 during the examination of Polish national village councils in 3 provinces in the west of Ukraine, Yemilchino, Novograd-Volynski, and Szepetівka. It was concluded that in those 3 regions, neither of the state campaigns, collectivization, grain procurement, and mobilization of funds had been completed. In the eyes of the authorities, the reasons for such low-level engagement in state initiatives were twofold. First, the negative impact of so-called Kurkul counter-revolutionary activists, and second, the insufficient development of party and mass work on the Polish population. A certain party inspector named Wisniewski noted that he could not find any evidence that among the various village councils, the Central Committee's decision to implement collectivization had even ever been discussed with its poor and middle Polish peasants. He summarized that the National Soviets had failed to become Soviet strongholds on the ground, mobilize the poor peasantry, and guide the process of collectivization and mass work. Chaotic and violent implementation of the accelerated collectivization led to food shortages and eventual starvation of population. The first signs of the famine in Polish-populated Volhynia region became noticeable in the spring of 1932. Already on 25th of February 1932, a report entitled "About the First Instances of Swelling and Exhaustion Due to Starvation in the Region" was forwarded to the central authorities. Among the most affected localities, the Polish-populated town and villages of Marchlewsk, Mar'yanivka, Huta Justynivka, Nowy Zawod, Prutiivka, Turovo, Henrychivka, and Bykiivka were named. No actions in response to those reports were taken. Instead, the Soviet propaganda campaign against those undermining the state policies was intensified. On the pages of the Soviet press, a decisive campaign against Kurkuli aiming to sabotage the Soviet campaign was launched. Furthermore, the failure of the grain requisitioning campaign was linked to the activities of so-called nationalists and fascists from among the national minorities. Poles and Germans, two most distrusted minority groups, which in addition proved to be least engaged in the process of socialist state building, were labeled as sabotage or Szkiednicki nations. In addition, they were also accused of espionage, sabotage, collaboration with the fascists, and taking part in anti-Soviet underground activities. The more opposition to state initiatives on the ground, the more political repression ensued. Ever more party activists were sent to local villages to control the process of grain collection. Starting from January 1933, bread was not allowed to be freely sold. While grist mills had already been nationalized, privately owned quern stores were proclaimed illegal, confiscated, and their owners fined. In the period between September 1932 to January 1933, in Marklevsk region alone, 102 quern stones were confiscated. In 35 recorded cases, the fine was 625 rubles, 50 kopiyuk, which is an average salary, an annual salary of a vet doctor back in 1929. These repressive methods paid back. In December 1932, the Marklevsk region once again exceeded the grain procurement quota and delivered 104.1% of grain in all the sectors, kolkhoz and individual households. It comes as no surprise that excessive grain requisitioning increased the starvation of the population. According to the calculations made by Polish historian Henryk Strącki, in March 1933, 654 adults and 1,106 children in the villages of the Marklevsk region were recorded as swollen and exhausted by hunger. The regional and central authorities were well aware of the situation in the Polish districts. On 6 March 1933, in his report to the Central KPBU, the party secretary of the Marklevsk region, certain Marchewski, reported that lately a number of those affected by the famine had increased significantly. And I quote, in 16 villages, there are between 3 to 10 starving families. In the village of Drenecki Chatki, there are already 20 families affected. Separate village Soviets report about 30 to 40 families, end of quote. The town of Marklevsk itself fared much better, and the famine was less noticeable there. The town had a ceramic factory and other industries whose employees, as well as their families, had access to the state-run canteens. In other semi-industrial centers of the region, like village of Bykivci, workers received between 400 to 600 grams of bread daily, depending on the nature of their work. The first assistance from the state was received in the region only in late 1933. Members of kolkhoz and individual farmers received 600 tons of grain for personal use, or 12 kilograms of grain per person, in addition to 250 tons of seed grain for kolkhoz members only. So a total number of victims in the Marklevsk region, according to the calculations made by the contemporary historians working on the National Book of Remembrance of the Victims of Holodomor in 1932-33 in Ukraine, dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the famine, was 348, with the biggest number, 34, in the town of Marklevsk itself. While it is not possible to estimate the total number of the Polish victims of the Holodomor, Ukrainian historian Stanislaw Kulczycki, based on the statistics from civil registers, suggests that the total number of victims was 20,700 victims, which is around 4% of the total Polish population, as counted by the 1926 census. So why is it important to take into account this ethnic perspective? Investigating the non-Ukrainian victims of the Holodomor will not increase the number of total victims or magnify the crimes committed by the Central Soviet authorities. And of course, there is no need to do this. Employing an ethnic lens, however, sets this Ukrainian tragedy into a wider international context. At the same time, it helps us understand better the Soviet policies internally. Indeed, minority communities were subjected to similar state policies and equally suffered under the repressive Soviet system. But there were important differences too. But collectivization and decolectivization is concerned, Poles, same as other minority communities, often suffered disproportionately in comparison to their Ukrainian neighbors, since they were often regarded less loyal to the regime and subjected to even more persecutions. Yet the minorities, unlike the Ukrainian peasants, sometimes had more options to survive, because they had families and foreign governments across the border. They had an option to leave even if it was becoming more and more difficult, or receive material help from the foreign governments, as in the case of the German minority. Instead, with all borders sealed, internal passports introduced, and information blockade, the Ukrainian peasantry was simply left to starve. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for organizers, sponsors and staff, which were helpful for us. My presentation is connected and corresponds with Karolina's, Professor Andrzejewski and Professor Hnatiuk papers, and you remember from their presentation that in 1933 a lot of initiatives took place in New York, Paris, Warsaw, Lviv, Prague, Berlin and Vienna. But in my presentation, I will be interested only in initiatives that took place in interwar Poland at the initiative of the Ukrainian community, National Democrats and Socialists. Why did I choose the initiative taken in Poland by several aid organizations? The answer to this question will organize the order of the topics of my presentation. First of all, these were actions taken on an international scale. They also tried to organize help for the famine victims. Secondly, the first attempts were made to collect evidence, document the Soviet crime in Ukraine, and to collect information from open sources on the economic situation in the Soviet Union and in particular in Soviet Ukraine, to prepare information materials based on this knowledge. Based on these sources, many studies were prepared in the form of brochures, books, information, leaflets, and posters. The first attempts to conceptualize the Great Famine were also made. At that time, reflections on its planned artificial and genocidal dimensions appeared in the writings of Ukrainian social and political activists in Poland. In my speech, in other words, I would like to present Ukrainians in Poland as one of the creators of the concept of the Holodomor as a mass crime in Soviet Ukraine, even before Raphael Lemkin defined genocide. These were not only articles in local newspapers writing in Ukrainian and read by friends and friends of friends. For example, Sojusz Ukrainek in Poland engaged International Women's Organization to publicize the issue of famine in the international arena. Ukrainians in Poland prepared expert opinions on which activists of many Western European and American organizations based their actions. This initiative were discussed by historians when the archive of the Social Committee for Aid for Ukraine was discovered in the National Library in Warsaw collections since 20 years. It includes materials confirming the activity of the committee and its correspondence with committees in Europe and the US. Individual sources materials on the committee activities are also in Lviv, the archival collection of the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance in Central Historical Archive in Lviv, which was created after World War II from the remnants of materials and survived the war occupation and the border change. Probably the perceived materials constitute wall in the past. I came to this conclusion by thoroughly analyzing the materials from both of these collections. Valuable materials are also in the Central Media Archive in Warsaw, Slavonic Library and Prague, and National Archive in Prague. Until now, however, they have only been used to reconstruct the events of 1933-1934. The contents of internal party documents and information leaflets were not analyzed. So what I do? The sources base of my research is archival materials from the collection in Warsaw, Lviv, Prague, commentary texts and press reports from 1932, 1933, and a couple of visual representations from these leaflets. Let me start with some facts which will briefly outline the context for my discourse analysis. The representative of the Ukrainian community who were present in the public life in the whole country, the hierarchs of the Greek Catholic Church and Polish politicians of Ukrainian origin from diaspora and after World War First immigrant community were involved in the protest of the Second Polish Republic. I know it's too hard. The first reports of the situation in the Soviet Ukraine were in the Dilo newspaper in August 1932. They understood the situation in Soviet Ukraine as systematic, evident extermination of the Ukrainian people. Such analytical publication did not often happen, which is understandable, but the next period of coverage of the Holodomor began in Dilo after the meeting of the UNDO Central Committee, June 1933, at which resolutions regarding the situation in Soviet Ukraine were adopted. Almost immediately, Dilo newspaper published an article entitled "The Dictatorship of Famine." Both the resolution and the newspaper mentioned above publication agreed on the intentional and planned nature of the famine in Soviet Ukraine. On the 21st of July 1933, the Greek Catholic Episcopate, headed by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, issued a proclamation in which he emphasized that the Ukrainians in Galicia were powerless and had no possibility of helping their compatriots in Great Ukraine. All they could do was pray and fast for the dying victims of famine. The next day, at extraordinary meeting of the Ukrainian parliamentary representation in Lviv, in the presence of 48 representatives of 44 Ukrainian organizations in the Second Polish Republic, the Ukrainian Public Committee of the Risky of Ukraine was established, headed by Dmytro Levitsky, head of the UNDO and Ukrainian Parliament representation, and editor of the Dilo newspaper. On the other hand, deputy speaker of the Sejm, Wasyl Mudry, and member of Polish Sejm, Milena Rudnicka, headed the executive committee of this organization. The statutory goals of the new organization were to be both the organization of the Day of National Mourning, raising money for the famine victims, and collaboration with other similar organizations, especially Andriy Zhou, Lubomir Makarushka and Father Zerovich were also connected with the activities of the committee. On the 9th of September 1933, the main board of Ukrainian Central Committee initiative a meeting of representatives of Polish-Ukrainian organization was convened in Warsaw, where the possibilities of helping the famine victims in Ukraine were discussed. On the 16th of September 1933, at the meeting of the Warsaw Ukrainian Emigre Organizations, the Ukrainian Immigration Committee of the Risky of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Central Committee in Poland was established. A 7-person board was also elected, Dr. Lewko Czekalenko as a president, engineer Yevhen Holovinsky, deputy chairman and treasurer, Gleb Lazarevsky as a secretary. The appointed committee was not registered as a separate organization and therefore operated solely within this part of Ukrainian Central Committee. On the 17th of October 1933, Metropolitan Sheptytsky returned to his previous appeals for individual fast for the Greek Catholic Church believers as a mortuary sacrifice for the souls of those compatriots who died due to the famine. On the 19th of October 1933, Lviv was to host a national day of mourning in memory of the Holodomor victims. The Provincial Security Department forbade the ceremony to be countrywide. Therefore, all meetings were held in the local committees for aid. Much information about this can be found in the document collection of the National Aid Committee at the National Library in Warsaw. On the 3rd of November 1933, Dmytro Levitsky spoke in the Sejm, criticizing the Polish authorities' position, especially in preventing the organization of the Day of Mourning on the 29th of October 1933 in Lviv. Regret was expressed in this speech. However, at the same session, on the 5th of February 1934, Levitsky directly appealed for help from the Polish nation and brought support for the initiatives of Ukrainian cycles in Poland. In Ukrainian newspapers in Poland, as in other countries, there were press articles contain early statistics, analysis of the situation in Soviet Ukraine, and forecast of the run of events. Many such texts were published in the Dilo newspaper, edited by Mudry and Levitsky. The newspaper very often and its various forms used publication of the European press. At the one hand, it was more or less reliable sources of information. On the other hand, it served as an argument to substantiate the importance and urgency of the problem. There were several important directions in the coverage of the Holodomor, stories about the Holodomor in Ukraine, thanks to the memories and testimonies of eyewitnesses, showing the world's reaction to the Holodomor and accordingly efforts to influence international public opinion, revealing the activities of the Ukrainian Public Committee for the Rescue of Ukraine, covering the trial of Mykola Lemek, who killed a high-ranking official in the Soviet consulate in Lviv, the 22nd of October 1933, interpretation of the issue of famine in Ukraine and the League of Nations Forum. On the other hand, the content of Levitsky's appeal to UNDO members can be found in the Central Historical Archive in Lviv. In one of the first paragraphs of this document, Levitsky writes that the Soviets cut Ukraine's clothes by famine, Pokora na Holodom, for its independence efforts. Additional, in the content of this document, it was emphasized that during the local meetings that day, it's necessary to discuss the main thesis contained in Vasyl Mudry work Лихоліття України. At the same time, as you remember, a lot of international activities was organized. I just remind you one connected with Milena Rudnitska because of lack of time. For the first time, the opportunity to present this issue in the international arena came at the 9th Congress of National Minorities held in Bern on September 16 and 19, 1933. This Congress was attended by 11 national groups from 10 European countries. Ukrainians living in Poland were represented by 2 UNDO members and at the same time members of the Ukrainian Public Committee of the Rescue of Ukraine. In her speech, Rudnitska emphasized that famine is a murder weapon used deliberately by Red imperialism to perdition the Ukrainian nation. In fact, this topic was not discussed at any official meeting of the League of Nations, but the so-called consultations on the 29th of September 1933. Moreover, the Council recognized itself as inappropriate and incompetent to take action to this issue and referred to the International Red Cross. In order to be able to organize any aid in the Soviet Union, the International Red Cross had to receive an appropriate request from the Soviet Red Cross. However, such an appeal was not received, and the Soviet Committee denied the famine in Soviet Ukraine and decided that the International Red Cross fell victim to anti-Soviet propaganda. Nevertheless, the possibility of mediation the International Red Cross in individual cases was left if such private requests were received. In her memories from 1955, published in the series of articles in the daily Svoboda, Rudnitska, in the open sentence, defined the causes of mass starvation in Ukraine in 1933 is stifling the resistance of Ukrainian peasants against collectivization and taming the rebellious Ukrainian nation. I would also like to point out that the authors of the protocols use precisely the same terminology in the internal documents of the Soyuz Ukrainak in Lviv from 1933-1934. Moreover, it's for obvious reasons identical to what appears in the internal UNDO documents referred to earlier. The term destructive economy of the Soviet in Ukraine also appears rarely, and early conceptualizations. Meanwhile, Vasyl Mudry and Andrei Zhou in 1933 prepared 2 books. Second one, first one. as a supplement of the Lviv newspaper Dila. Both of the studies briefly explain the situation in Soviet Ukraine, explain the causes of the famine, and emphasize its artificial and planned nature. Additionally, the actions taken by the Ukrainian Risky Committee were described. Vasil Mudryk clearly emphasized that the policy of the Soviet Union was intentional, in which famine was used as an effective weapon in the fight against the Ukrainian national spirit. He literally spoke of the slow death of the Ukrainian people under Soviet economic rules. In February 1934, Levko Chekalenko, mentioned in the context of the Warsaw Committee, prepared a memorial paper entitled Famine in Ukraine and the Action to Help its Victims Outside the Soviet Union, dated 6th of February 1934. The document was prepared at the request of Lieutenant Władysław Gutre. The original and the translation currently is in the Central Military Archive in Warsaw. In addition to being one of the first few conceptualizations of the Holodomor, these documents define it as a result of the conscious socialist nationalist policy of the Moscow Communist Party in Ukraine and the response to it by the bored masses of the Ukrainian population. It also contains information about the intentions of the Warsaw Committee of the Risky of Ukraine in publishing a book about the tragic event. In through, Chekalenko emphasized in February that its intention was unsuccessful, although it was known that the work affiliated with the committee mentioned above was created that year. Its author is Gleb Lazarevsky, and the book was entitled Famine in Ukraine, and its book was published in Warsaw, 1934, in Polish. For all these authors, it was common to view the situation in Ukraine and the Bolsheviks carrying out an imperial colonial policy in Ukraine. For them, the Bolshevik government resorted to inhuman means to break the resistance of the Ukrainian people. They artificially erased the national character of Ukrainian literature and science, forcing them to serve communist Moscow internationalism through terror. Bolshevik pressure oppressed the Ukrainian people more and more persistently. They imprisoned and deported Ukrainians and physically destroyed nationally conscious peasants, workers, and intellectuals economically. Moreover, artificial famine is a weapon of mass murder in this war. Moreover, Mudry, Lazarevsky, Zhou, and Chekalenko referenced a similar set of press texts from publicity available sources and letters addressed to Amanda and Movenik, which their counterparts, texts of appeals and speeches published in the press describing the situation in Ukraine. Then all this mentioned above, the early conceptualization of Holodomor also appeared in the study of Alexander Shulgin, Besteretory. In his book published in 1934, Shulgin presented the Holodomor as one of the examples of the politics of Moscow occupiers for the extermination of Ukrainian as a nation. Also, in the works of Olgierd Ippolit-Bochkovsky, we can find references to three mentioned books, Mudry, Zhou, and Lazarevsky. Word and image, last but not least. About the time, however, the first visual representation of the Great Famine appeared in two copies I could identify during inquiries in Warsaw and Prague. It's about a leaflet prepared by the artist Vasil Masyutin, former Ukrainian People Republic officer, living in Berlin, entitled To Your Heart, Brother and Sister. It aimed to encourage Ukrainians living in Germany to join the aid campaign for the famine in Soviet Ukraine. The artist showed the family, only the female figure in the foreground, holding the deceased child's body above the head, draws particular attention. An alternative example of visual representation of the Great Famine in 1933, as you remember in the previous slide, was the proposal for a cover of Gleb Lazarevsky book designed by Ivan Kurach from my left side. One example of is in the Slavonic Library in Prague, collection of the Ukrainian Academy of Fine Arts. On his cover, Kurach, a member of the Warsaw Artistic Association Spoki, presented the Grim Reaper in a Budyonovka hat. However, Lazarevsky's work appeared in Warsaw in 1934 with a different cover. The cover is from my right side. The cover depicts a red star crossing out of human existence. I am also not sure about the authorship of this cover, which is the third visual representation of the Holodomor related of the Famine Aid Committee's in 1933-1934. However, it's worth being aware that none of this visual representation directly impacted the Holodomor visual culture. Indirectly, only leaflet by Masiutin could have influenced it, but it was not part of the Polish discourse. This representation was only distributed in the territory of the Second Polish Republic. The analysis of the discourse around the Holodomor in the Second Polish Republic and its reception abroad allowed several conclusions. Firstly, the aid committee's activists did not help victims of the Holodomor. However, the organization of emergency relief in individual cases cannot be denied. As an umbrella organization, the Ukrainian Public Committee of the Rescue of Ukraine in Poland consolidated quite a large group of organizations in Europe and called the town for the activities of all the others. Secondly, the primary efforts were made to collect evidence of Soviet crime in Ukraine and to collect information from open sources on the economic situation in the Soviet Union and in particular in Soviet Ukraine, to prepare information materials based on this knowledge. Thirdly, at that time, reflections of its planned, artificial, and genocidal dimensions appeared in the writings of Ukrainian social and political activists in Poland. Today, I just try to present Ukrainians from the Second Polish Republic as one of the creators of the concept of the Holodomor as a mass crime in Soviet Ukraine before Raphael Lemkin defined genocide. Ukrainians in Poland prepared expert opinions on which activities of many Western European and American organizations based their actions. The authors of many following reports were based on these first conceptualizations of the Holodomor published in Poland. Two names are worth mentioning here, Alexander Shurin and Olgier Topolit-Boczkowski. Their studies on this subject contain numerous references of the works of Andrzej Żuk, Wasyl Mudry and Gleb Lazarevsky published in Lviv and Warsaw. Moreover, perhaps last but not least conclusion in my presentation, the facts cited make us realize that the way of understanding the moral of the Holodomor as a mass crime appears in the early stages of fighting its effects. However, the way of its visual representations play a supportive role. It was a background. Ukrainian politicians and activists, not only in Poland but also outside of it, had used only words as a weapon. Thank you.
Good morning, or rather good afternoon. First of all, let me thank Daria and John and all the organizers for your kind invitation. My congratulations for this really excellent conference. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you. I'd like to say a few words today about the circumstances on the international stage, in particular on Poland's attitude, which had an impact on the Holodomor. Of all the Western governments, with the possible exception of Germany, the authorities in Warsaw probably had the most complete information about the situation in Soviet Ukraine. It was provided by the extensive network of Polish diplomatic, consular, and intelligence outposts in the USSR. I have already spoken and written about this on other occasions, so I will only recall that the reports coming from Ukraine gave an accurate picture of the acute food crisis developing from mid-1932. Polish observers realized that the famine in the USSR had been provoked by the actions of the Soviet authorities and that its catastrophic proportions in Ukraine and the North Caucasus were the result of deliberate decisions made in the Kremlin. In retrospect, they quite unanimously estimated the number of victims of the famine at around 5 million. They also saw a close connection between the repression that fell on the Ukrainian countryside and the nationally conscious intelligentsia. However, with extensive knowledge of the tragedy in Ukraine, the Polish authorities took virtually no action. Documents prove that they were afraid of publicizing the issue of famine. This was despite clear suggestions to undertake an anti-Soviet information campaign made by Polish diplomats sending reports from Ukraine. These suggestions were consistently rejected, both by the Foreign Ministry in Warsaw and the Polish legation in Moscow. The Polish position may seem surprising. Actually, from the very beginning of official relations, the Second Republic and Soviet Russia were in a state of Cold War, only rarely interrupted by a short episode of thaw. Warsaw, even while avoiding open confrontation, never passed up an opportunity to exploit, for example, by unofficially inspiring the press, news of the Soviet stumbles and difficulties. Why then was news of the terrible famine not exploited? Why was there no effort to mobilize Polish and foreign opinion against the Soviets, to act as a defender of the starving? This is all the more striking as for a long time the Polish ruling circles were betting precisely on the Ukrainian card in their game with Russia. They were counting on the gradual emancipation of Soviet Ukraine or on the outbreak of a peasant revolt that would wipe out the Bolsheviks' rule. However, the situation had changed. Hopes of an anti-Soviet outbreak in Ukraine were undermined by the Bolsheviks' successful campaign of forced collectivization launched in late 1929. The Soviet authorities, although with great difficulty and not everywhere, pacified the turmoil in the Ukrainian countryside. This must have disappointed the Polish side and put an end to plans to intervene, if anyone had indeed floated them. The idea of Poland's active involvement in Ukrainian affairs in 1933 seemed even less feasible in this situation. In 1932, the ally of foreign intervention may still have been the desperation of the peasantry, oppressed by increasing burdens and hungry. A year later, however, it was to reach its breaking point, giving way to passivity and resignation. Polish observers were aware of this. We have here two telling quotations from the Polish intelligence reports on it. The weakening of peasant resistance in Ukraine had an impact on the obsolescence of the Ukrainian question, but was not its primary cause. The main role was played by a change in the international conjuncture, which prompted Warsaw and Moscow to seek an agreement. The first step on this path was the signing of a Polish-Soviet non-aggression pact in July 1932, which created a formal framework for the town in mutual relations. However, real rapprochement was not to occur until several months later. Of key importance was the increasingly clear prospect of the Nazis seizing power in Germany, Nazis declaring open hostility to communism and the Soviet Union. In the new situation, the question of whether it would be possible for the USSR to continue the Rapallo line, that is, the anti-Polish and anti-Versailles cooperation between Moscow and Berlin, appeared in full force. Stalin was particularly concerned about the new regime in Germany easing relations with Poland and the two countries coming to an agreement. The Soviet dictator's anxiety was heightened by rumors circulating in diplomatic circles from early 1933 that Poland was ready to cede the so-called Pomeranian corridor to Germany in exchange for Berlin's consent to territorial acquisitions at the expense of Lithuania and Soviet Ukraine. The second issue absorbing Stalin was the USSR's increasingly tense relations with Japan and the possibility of armed conflict in the Far East. All these considerations made it a priority for the Kremlin leadership to secure the Soviet Union's western border. This was subject to two conditions. Firstly, the full subjugation of Ukraine, which was to become in Stalin's words, a fortress of the USSR. And secondly, the neutralization of Poland, or better still, attracting it into full cooperation with Soviets. To achieve the second objective, Stalin decided to use the channels of personal diplomacy, bypassing the pro-German oriented People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. The main intermediary in talks with the Poles became the editor of the daily Izviestia, and at the same time head of the newly created International Information Office of the Central Committee of the party, Karl Radek, very known person. The first surveys took place in December 1932 after the ratification of the Polish-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. At that time, Radek gave a signal in a series of talks with Polish diplomats held in Moscow that the USSR was ready for a profound reorientation of its foreign policy. We do not recognize the notion of a state in principle, he declared. But as long as states exist, it is advantageous for us to have a strong Poland that does not prevent us from realizing our experiment and that separates us from the more typical representatives of the imperialist world. The authorities in Warsaw read these signals well and decided to take up the diplomatic game with Moscow. Colonel Bogusław Miedziński, Piłsudski's trusted man, former minister and senior intelligence officer, was delegated to negotiate with Radek. At the end of April, Colonel Miedziński went to Moscow on a confidential mission. On behalf of Piłsudski, he made a proposal to Radek that Poland and the USSR establish serious cooperation in the international field. This proposal was forwarded to Stalin and was accepted by him. The price demanded by the Soviet leader was the abandonment by Poland to playing up the Ukrainian issue, something that was extremely feared in the Kremlin. On behalf of Stalin, Radek categorically declared to the Polish interlocutor, any activity of yours in this area, that is Ukraine, will be commented on by us as a conscious or unconscious execution of German plans in the East. Negotiations continued in July 1933 after Radek arrived in Warsaw. Of key importance during his trip was an extended meeting between Stalin's emissary and Polish Foreign Minister Józef Beck. Beck allegedly, we have only a report by Radek on this meeting, Beck went so far as to propose to the Soviets the conclusion of a de facto anti-German defensive alliance. He also proposed a general realignment of Polish and Soviet interests in the area from the Black Sea to the Baltic. Unofficial talks between Stalin's and Piłsudski's emissaries led to an unprecedented fall in Polish-Soviet relations in summer and autumn 1933. The external manifestation of this new era became not only the revival of political contacts, but also of cultural, scientific, and military exchanges. The Ukrainian question remained in the background all the time. Of extraordinary importance to Stalin was the assurance Radek heard in Warsaw from Colonel Miedziński. He said that the activity of Polish intelligence in the USSR would be radically curtailed, above all in Ukraine. This line was consistently adhered to from then on. Relevant directives were also given to Polish diplomats in the USSR. However, Poland's maintenance of neutrality towards events in Ukraine did not fully satisfy the Soviet side. Stalin's aim was to induce the authorities in Warsaw to take openly anti-Ukrainian measures. The Kremlin leader was outraged by Poland's toleration on its territory of the activities of 8 committees and the anti-Soviet campaign conducted by Ukrainian organizations. A sharp clash over this issue occurred in connection with the assassination of Alexei Mailov, an official at the Soviet consulate in Lviv. The assassin turned out to be Mykola Łemyk, a militant of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists who wanted to protest with this act against the genocidal policy of the Soviets. Moscow used the Lviv events as a pretext to launch a sharp note with the Polish Foreign Ministry. It pointed out the close iunctim between Mailov's assassination and the Ukrainian propaganda campaign tolerated by the Poles. Here is a fragment of this very sharp note. In the new situation, the Poles were forced to take certain restrictive measures. Among other things, censorship of the Ukrainian press was tightened, and the celebration of the day of national mourning organized by Polish Ukrainians was made more difficult. For the Soviet side, however, this was not a sufficient response. It seems that in Moscow, it was hoped that Mailov's assassination would become an impulse for the Polish authorities to re-evaluate their previous policy and undertake a crackdown on the Ukrainian national movement on the territory of the Second Polish Republic. The coordination of anti-Ukrainian repressions by Poland and the Soviet Union was to be a test and at the same time one of the foundations of a new political constellation. This interpretation is suggested by a very interesting document, a report by Jerzy Potocki, the Polish ambassador here on the left, in Ankara from November 1933. In it, the diplomat recounted his meeting with the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, Kliment Voroshilov, one of Stalin's closest collaborators, who was visiting Turkey. A very cordial conversation between Voroshilov and Potocki took place during a rave at the USSR embassy. The Soviet dignitary enthused about the Polish army and drank to the health of Marshal Piłsudski, but the atmosphere changed, and he was showing certain irritation when appeared a reference to Mailov's assassination. Changing his tone and showing irritation, the Narcom then uttered the thought, certainly not an accidental one. In his mouth, that is one of Stalin's trusted men, it must have sounded like a threat, but also a kind of proposal to Poland. Voroshilov said that he was surprised that Poland was so indulgent towards the Ukrainians and not dealing with them harshly enough. As in Soviet Russia, the Ukrainians were kept in complete check. The Polish ambassador then sharply cut off the discussion. Similar was the reaction of the ruling circles in Warsaw, who were interested in normalizing relations with the Soviets, but did not intend to take up the suggestion of joint action against the Ukrainians. The Polish position on this issue was one of the factors that determined the failure of a viable rapprochement between Moscow and Warsaw. However, something else was crucial. Piłsudski, in deciding in spring 1933 to hold talks with Stalin's emissary, was playing an elaborate game from the outset. His aim was not to conclude an alliance with the USSR, but to strengthen Poland's position as much as possible and to disrupt the existing Soviet-German cooperation. The negotiations with Stalin were a bargaining chip in the game he was playing with Berlin at the same time. By improving its relations with the USSR, Poland was raising its stakes. From the spring of 1933, confidential Polish-German negotiations took place in parallel to the Polish-Soviet talks. This eventually led in January 1934 to signing a Polish-German Declaration of Non-Violence. This event shocked European diplomatic circles, convinced that the Polish-German antagonism was insurmountable. The treaty increased Poland's room for maneuver, allowing Warsaw to balance quite effectively between Germany and the USSR for the next 4 years. Its conclusion, however, was a huge disappointment for Stalin. From Moscow's point of view, the only favorable solution would have been to induce Poland to cooperate fully and unconditionally with the Soviets. The policy of balance practiced by Minister Beck was met with hostility. As a result, from the beginning of 1934, Polish-Soviet relations began to deteriorate again at a rapid pace. As for the unfortunate negotiator, Karl Radek, he eventually lost Stalin's confidence, which probably determined his fate during the upcoming Great Purge. The diplomatic maneuvers between Moscow and Warsaw had a disastrous impact on the fate of the Ukrainians. The Polish-Soviet detente of 1932-33 may not have been the decisive factor, but it certainly made it easier for the Stalinist leadership to crack down on the Ukrainian countryside and on independent tendencies in Soviet Ukraine. Poland hitherto keeping a close eye on developments in Ukraine and ready to become more or less involved in the area, passively watched events for many months. And so the Ukrainian case once again fell victim to an exceptionally unfavorable international conjuncture. Thank you very much.
Let me thank, first of all, Daria and John and Daria, for inviting me at this conference. So my paper is on crossing the Soviet-Romanian border during the Holodomor, 1931-33. Actually, I will stick to that, not to the whole 1930s, as indicated in the program. Among the best known earlier reaction to food crisis and famines are hoarding, cutting down consumption, and mass migration from affected areas to better off ones. Migration could be internal or involve crossing international borders. During the Soviet famine of 1931-33, known in Ukraine as the Holodomor, moving internally from one region to another was not easy due to the existence of blacklisted areas, the so-called Черные доски. Thus, for the inhabitants of the Borderlands, it was often safer to cross the frontier with Romania and Poland than risk being apprehended by GPU or NKVD patrols. In this paper, I will deal with the incidences and scale of border crossing into Romania from the Moldavian Autonomous Republic, a part of Ukraine. I'll look into the motivations, the social and identity of those deciding to leave for Romania, and specifically into how the Soviet and Romanian border guards dealt with illegal border crossing during the famine years relative to normal years. First, I would look into the Soviet conceptualization of the state borders, specifically the Soviet-Romanian one. Then I will give a very brief account on the scale of Holodomor in Moldavian Autonomous Republic and explain the different policies the Soviets pursued toward the border districts and the hinterland ones. In the end, I will discuss some conclusions about the illegal border crossing from MSSR to Romania during the Holodomor and elaborate on what this tells us about the Soviet regime. I also will refer to the border crossing during 1946-47 famine, when the border with Romania moved westward along the Prut River, and how that was similar or dissimilar to crossing border into a country that was already in 1944 in the Soviet sphere of influence and not a bourgeois, capitalist, inimical state like in the interwar years. So a few words about the Soviet concept of state border and some specificity of the Soviet-Romanian one. The Dniester River would become Romania's eastern border after March 1918. However, the Soviets referred to it as the demarcation line throughout the interwar years. The Soviets claimed Romania was the first capitalist state to occupy the Soviet territory, even though the Bolsheviks never established their rule in Bessarabia in 1917 or 18. And in the whole ex-Tsarist empire, they represented a tiny minority at the local and provincial level. Conversely, the Romanian point of view, from the Romanian point of view, the union of Bessarabia with Romania was voted into law by a local parliament, Sfatul Țării, in which the main social, political, and ethnic groups were represented. It is also important to note, as American historian Glyn Torrey argues, not only France and England, but also Germany, though for various reasons, endorsed the incorporation of Bessarabia into Romania in early spring 1918. After the civil war, despite the poor state of the economy and a devastating war, the Soviet state allocated significant resources to protecting the border. As Andrea Chandler argues, the Soviet border was one of the most prominent institutions of isolation from the very beginning to the regime's demise. Ideology and security reasons were the main factors behind the phenomenon. Sabine Dulin, for her part, has recently argued that the Soviets shared a revolutionary concept about many things, including state borders. They recognized them only in a relative sense, as Moscow never abandoned the world revolution paradigm altogether. Indeed, in the interwar period, the Soviets would send agents through Comintern to neighboring European states, as well as to the Western ones and elsewhere, actually, in an attempt to subvert national governments. In the Baltic states, Finland and Poland, the Soviets would limit in general their activities to gathering information, except for Estonia, where they organized an abortive coup d'etat in early December 1924. In Bessarabia, allegedly illegally annexed by Romania, they behaved more aggressively, sending small guerrilla commando for the whole period of 22 years to agitate for communism and organize sabotage on a regular basis. The Dniester River, a natural border, would make it theoretically more manageable for both Soviets and Romanians to protect their territories compared to the forest areas in the Ukrainian Polish and Belarusian Polish border. However, during the winter months, the icy Dniester became a bridge rather than a natural barrier. There were few significant discrepancies in the profile of those who participated in the flow of illegal crossings from the one bank to another for most of the interwar years. Romanian army deserters or persons who had quarreled with the law in general would cross the Dniester into Soviet territory, searching for a better life, and Soviets crossing into Romania would mainly do so for the same reasons. The peak of the illegal crossing from the Soviet side to the Romanian one coincided with the collectivization drives of late 1920s, early 30s, especially 1932-33. And now more specifically about the Holodomor in the Borderlands, before talking about the scale of the cross-border phenomenon during the Holodomor. Severe food shortages were registered in the Moldavian Autonomous Republic in February 1932 already. In late May 1932, those in dire straits because of lack of food counted no less than 25,000 individuals officially. By early July 1932, about 182,000 persons, official reports, comprising about 40% of the total population, suffered from hunger. Among the most affected areas were Slobozia, Tiraspol, and Dubasar districts on the border with Romania, and Balta, some 60 kilometers deep into the Soviet territory. Something there. I don't know if you can see that clearly on the map. As a strategy to minimize the flight to Romania, the local Soviet authorities, in conjunction with Kharkiv and Moscow ones, decided to give more relief to the border districts. The famine peaked in January-July 1933. According to my estimate, about 40,000 persons died of Holodomor in the Moldavian Autonomous Republic in 1932-33, or about 8% of the total population. Now more exactly on border crossing that I promised to focus on specifically. In the dire circumstances of the coming famine, many, especially in the border districts, decided to go to Romania. According to Romanian police sources used by my friend, historian from the Bucharest University, Alexandru Mironov, in 1931-33, 1931-33 represented the peak of inter-war illegal border crossing along the Dniester River. The data are incomplete and refer only to specific months, as they give, yet they give us an idea of the scale of this phenomenon. According to Soviet sources, already in February 1931, due to repressions and fiscal pressure, 35 Soviet citizens decided to try their luck by going to Romania. In January 1932, about 300 families illegally crossed the border with Romania. In February and March the same year, 1932, another 400 and respectively 500 families followed the lead. In total, in the first 3 months of 1932, about 4,500 individuals crossed the border with Romania successfully. By all means, not every attempt to go abroad was successful. In March 1932 alone, for instance, more than 200 persons failed to cross the Soviet-Romanian border, while other 30 were being killed by the Soviet border patrols when trying to cross the Dniester River into Bessarabia. In early spring 1932, the GPU officials responsible for patrolling the border registered another about 2,000 individuals who were planning to flee to Romania, but had not decided yet when to embark on this risky journey fraught with mortal danger. As it happened with a peasant family of 5 persons from the village of Beloch, Ribnica district, just on the border, who were killed by the Soviet political police on the 3rd of March 1932. Or to a woman with a child aged 13 from Cocier-Dubasar a week later, also in the border area. Among those crossing the border were not only poor individual peasants, lichniki and kolkhozniki, but also Soviet activists like Filipi Ipati, for instance, from Nezavertailovka, Slobozia district, or communist youth members, the Komsomolce, such as Anton Wenger from Ribnica. A Romanian police report from January-October 1932 counts about 740 cases of illegal crossing along all Romanian borders, including those with Bulgaria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. The number for the whole year 1932 along the Dniester River alone might be higher, as data for the other years indicated the Soviet citizens represented an overwhelming majority among border intruders. In addition, the Soviet statistics give the highest number for 1932 and 1933, that is about 16,000 each year for crossing the entire Soviet border from the Finnish, Estonian, Latvian, Polish, and Romanian border in the west to the Chinese and Japanese ones in the far east. In 1933, at least 66 refugees were entering Romania from the Soviet Union, all of which crossed the border in June. Given the Soviet data for 1933 are as high as those for 1932, the actual number should be much greater for the whole year, but it is difficult to gauge even the approximate figures at this level, at least, because it's a research in progress. These statistics cover all crossing border attempts. It includes those who were shot dead by the border guards, usually by the Soviet ones, but sometimes by Romanians, which is a difficult, it's an impossible topic to be discussed in Romania and Moldova as well. Because there is Soviets are bad, Romanians are good, probably in Poland, probably you have the same, in other countries. So we're trying to break through this kind of white and black. The peak of the border shootings was also 1932. The Soviet border guards killed 40 Soviet citizens trying to cross into Romania in February 1932 in what has been called the Olena massacre. Bucharest authorities brought this case at the attention of the League of Nations in Geneva. On the other side, the Romanian border patrols shot dead 6 youngsters on January 9, 1932, 5 of them Jews. Moreover, even though the Romanian authorities knew the famine accounted for the great bulk of the border crossings in this period, they handed over some of them to the Soviets, for instance, in October 1932. The motives for doing so are not clear. One can assume that Romanian Bessarabia was far from paradise on earth, including during the Great Depression, even though repression and famine were not mass phenomena. Due to several measures taken by the Soviet authorities and probably to the diachronic actions or the border patrols, the tendency to flee to Romania in the fall of 1932 decreased substantially relative to the previous months. During the peak of the famine, in January-May 1933, the main form of protest against the famine were peasant rebellions. This is very important. What forms of protest are specific for each stage of the famine. Yes. Often women participating actively in what Lin Viola, as you know, calls Babi Bunte. At least 131 Volinki, called alternatively in the documents, were reported in the Moldavian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in winter-spring 1933. So just briefly putting that in context, given the topic of our conference, border crossing during the Soviet famine of early 30s and in other areas. The Ukrainians and Kazakhs hit disproportionately by the Soviet famine of 1931-33, tried to flee abroad as well. In late 1931, a group of 60 people attempted to cross the Zbruch River, if I'm pronouncing correctly, into Poland. Only 14 succeeded. The rest drowned or were shot by border guards. Other 100 families would cross the Soviet-Polish border in winter spring 1933. The Kazakhs, hit by the famine even more than the Ukrainians proportionally, also tried to flee abroad, especially into China's Xinjiang province, as Robert Kindler and Sarah Cameron have documented recently, and Isabel Ohayon before them, actually. Thousands of them were killed by the Soviet border guards while trying to escape. In contrast to the Soviet West, it seems that in the Soviet East, shooting proved to be a cheaper and more effective way of borderland pacification during the interwar famine years and beyond. Land and longer land borders in Central Asia, more challenging to protect, might have contributed to these policies. Conclusions. The peak of the interwar border crossing into Romania coincided with the Holodomor years, especially winter-spring 1932. Hunger made people so desperate that they embarked on such a dangerous journey. Among them were not only poor individual peasants, единоличники, but also kolkhozniki and activists of different sorts. The majority of them, albeit not exclusively, were Romanian-speaking Moldavians, having or not relatives in Bessarabia. At least 4,500 individuals succeeded to flee to Romania in winter-spring 1932, while at least 70 were shot dead while trying to cross Dniester in the same period. The majority of them were killed by the Soviet border patrols, while others were shot by the Romanian, fearing among them could be Soviet spies. At least this is the official point of view of Romanian documents from this period. Probably Maxim Snihir will tell us more later today. In some instances, Romanian gendarmes handed over some refugees to the Soviets. Probably this was a result of the deal. The Soviets in return would apprehend Romanian citizens crossing illegally the border into the USSR, as often the illegal crossing into the Soviet territory was undertaken by the deserters from the Romanian army, which was a very sensitive issue. During the post-war famine of 1946-47, which I promised to refer in the beginning, hundreds of Bessarabians crossed the border with Romania in trying to escape the death from hunger. At least 12 of them have been killed by the Soviet border patrols on the Prut River this time, the newly established Soviet border after 1940 and again 1944. This time Romania was under the Soviet sphere of influence, with its army stationed there till 1957. Nevertheless, the Soviets did whatever it takes to discourage the illegal crossing of the state border. One of the reasons in 1946-47, as during the Holodomor of the early 30s, was to prevent the spread of information about the famine abroad. Even though crossing the border was a chance to survive for those embarking on it, the Soviet logic was to treat any illegal border crossing as state treason. The Soviet regime did not, in these cases, consider preserving human life a priority, as in other instances, of course. And last but not least, and probably the most important message I would want to convey with this presentation is that, as during the Soviet famine, the post-war famine, the Soviets used the same methods in fighting the cross-border trespassers, just like in the early 30s, and probably this speaks not about an improvisation, but about a Soviet pattern of dealing with starving people crossing the border as a survival strategy. Thank you very much.
Hello, should I go? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for our four panelists for your most interesting presentation. Your papers have enriched our understanding of the Holodomor by shifting our gaze away from the center by looking at instead the Holodomor through what Olena, kind of aptly puts it, the ethnic lens. So the first three papers focus on the Polish perspective, while Igor's paper, this last one, shed light on the famine in the Soviet Moldova, which is one of the least known episodes of the state terror under Stalin. So I've learned a great deal from you. And I have to confess that I'm not an expert, I'm a historian of modern China. I know about the Chinese famine a great deal, but I know very little about Holodomor, so I've learned a great deal from all of you. It's been so interesting. I also apologize. I had very much wanted to be with you physically in Cambridge, but due to some family illness, and I have to stay here, so I'm here on Zoom. Okay, so yeah, first of all, I just want to say something about, as you all know that you are actually expert in this area, and there have been many works on the subject providing useful analysis on the policy decision, economic trends, and demographic consequences of Holodomor. There are also kind of many excellent accounts on ways of dying. I'm not going to kind of list them, as most of you know. Bulk of this study focused mainly on how the party state had failed to provide provide for or deprived of, stolen from the peasantry, the hungry and dying, which we also heard it today in some of the papers which mentions this. What we also learned from Olena and Igor's paper today is that a huge number of villagers resisted collectivization from the start, or as Olena argues that, I'm quoting her here, the total collectivization was under the threat from very early on. Of course, this is not new. This topic has been dealt with in Lynn Viola's important study, Peasants, Rebels under Stalin. Olena and also Igor, I would also like to encourage you, kind of to explore, for instance, what form of resistance took places in these border regions where kind of your study focus on. You mentioned about running away, yeah, and border crossing, but were there other kind of resistance? For instance, did the church become more active as a result of collectivization or later the famine? And did more people also turn to popular everyday rituals? I don't know whether you come across sources like that, but it's worth to keep your eyes out for this, because this certainly has been one aspect during the Chinese famine, which I kind of studied. And so as a result of collectivization and the famine, that people turned back to traditional beliefs and they turned away from parties. So what they, kind of one of some phrase was the magic state has lost its magic. So people are turning away from it. They go in, kind of for, so they return to traditional beliefs. So, okay, so coming back to today's paper, both Olena and Igor's paper also show how the border regions, were often less affected by the famine, being at the periphery, as Olena shows, that allowed villagers more freedom from the iron rule of the Soviet authority. Also, Olena and Igor's paper to an extent show that being able to escape, was crucial for survival. But so my, kind of for me, I, kind of also like to look at, kind of whether, kind of to encourage you to think or to explore were there other tactics of survival. So for instance, where the villagers hide food or kept private plots. This was quite common during the Chinese famine. And also, were there any black markets in these border regions? So that's something, you know, kind of worth to think about. I have something quite specific for Igor. You know, your paper is very rich in data, and I would love to discuss more, you know, kind of about some of your data with you. But you know, kind of for someone who had worked on oral history, I would also, you know, like to hear or encourage you to include more individual personal accounts. For instance, account of escaping, you know, looking at from the survivor's perspective, you know, kind of what happened, you know, kind of how did they do it, etc. Also, could you please elaborate? Yeah, this is still on for Igor, you know, a bit more on the form of rebellion during the famine. So, what do you mean by you use the word rebellion? And so, what those rebellion consist of? Were they food riots or protests, or, you know, kind of armed rebellion? Maybe you could clarify a little bit. You also said towards the end, you mentioned something really interesting. You said that often women participate actively in these rebellions. So I would like to hear more about, you know, kind of women's participation, or if you haven't, you know, kind of like, you know, you could explore more about gender role, you know, kind of, so, you know, has one, you know, kind of has the, you know, kind of I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, kind of like, because what happened in the case of China, collectivization had moved, you know, kind of because traditionally women has an important role in managing food, yeah, and etc. You know, kind of and you know, kind of managing the food, you know, kind of storing food and how the food is sort of, you know, it's just, you know, kind of food management, household management, but collectivization had taken that away from, you know, kind of women, that power away from women, and give it to male managers in the collectives. So women really resisted, you know, collectivization, you know, for, you know, kind of for these reasons. So the other thing is also food shortages. Yeah, I think this might be, you know, kind of worth for Olena to think about it as well. Food shortages don't always lead to famine. So what happened in those few months from spring 1932 to winter 1933, that the initial food shortage escalated to severe famine? That's something worth to, you know, kind of pay your attention. Okay, I'm going to be very brief. I realize that we, you know, kind of actually run out of time. It's just for Victoria's paper. Victoria, your paper looked at Ukrainian immigrant community around the world, includes perhaps particularly women lobbyists, and had helped, you know, kind of with the help of mass media such as newspaper to disseminate the news of suffering in Ukraine. Yet these efforts, you know, kind of were mostly unsuccessful. And this is very different from what happened during the Irish famine. I don't know whether you're familiar with Christine Canini's work, Charity and Great Hunger in Ireland, The Kindness of Strangers, which shows that during the Irish famine, people throughout the world were mobilized to provide money, food, and clothing to assist the starving Irish. So in contrast to the silence around the Ukrainian famine during the Irish famine, and helped, you know, by the development of transport and communication, newspaper throughout the world reported on the suffering in Ireland. And this has prompted fundraising on an unprecedented level, which cut across religions, ethnic, social, and gender distinctions, with donations come from all around the world, you know, as far as Australia and South America. More, you know, many also give generously, you know, kind of who, you know, most of these people who give generously has no, you know, direct connection with Ireland. So Victoria, my question for you, or some, you know, a suggestion, this is just a suggestion, you could look at, you know, kind of to explore further that why during the Ukrainian famine, the effort made by Ukrainian immigrants to mobilize international support was unsuccessful compared to the Irish experience. And so why the news of famine was silenced? I mean, the lack of press coverage of famine in Poland, which was also mentioned in Olena's presentation as well. And Jan's excellent presentation makes arguments that the silence among the Polish authorities was due to the diplomatic maneuver between Moscow and Warsaw. But there's more to this story, I think. There was also, how do you explain the general silence around the world, despite the efforts made by the Ukrainian immigrant communities? Could this also have something to do with the ideological beliefs amongst the left around the world at the time, who saw the new USSR, as an ideal model for the state solution to provide welfare for all its citizens, as well as ending the problem of famine? I don't know whether any of you heard this book called Red Medicine by Arthur Newsom, which was published at this time in 1934, praised the welfare system in Soviet Union. So I think there's ideological blindness, kind of about the famine in the West that also led to the silence. So that's just, kind of some thoughts from me, but this might not be the case. Just something for you to think about. So I'm going to hand over to the panelists, whether you want to respond, or maybe you can open up the floor for questions from others.
In chronological order. So, Olena, would you like to respond to Shun's comments?
Thank you for the careful reading of my paper and the question and the suggestions. Actually, your suggestion about looking at the church is something really that would interest me a lot. And I'm just thinking, because obviously there was a lot during the 1920s of anti-Catholic campaign going on in the Soviet Union more generally, but also in Ukraine. And I would be interested to see how those religious beliefs, whether, the role of the church, that's something really interesting that I would like to consider more. And thank you for the suggestions, indeed, like kind of to fill in more gaps in my narrative. And I really like this point on ideological blindness from the West, which I think is something to explore more. But there were no direct questions, I think. So I would just like to thank you for your comments. And this is there are just definitely some points to explore.
Wiktoria?
For comments and some other point of view of my papers will be very helpful. But if I have one, may I have a question for colleagues?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So my first question is to Olena. Maybe I missed it, but how you define the Polish minority in Soviet Ukraine? Because Polish origin people live not only in Marchlewsk region, and what about their situation? You reflect their situation, so situation people who lived without Marchlewsk region border. And my second question is to Igor. While I'm working with my sources, I found a short piece of information about the aid committee organized by Ukrainians, emigrants from Greater Ukraine after the World War First in Bucharest. And do you know about their environment, their help for refugees? Thank you.
Okay, should I?
Yes, please. Jacek?
I'd like to thank for your insightful comments and all the suggestions. I realized that my short presentation was regarding only a small facet of the problem, and I addressed only one aspect of international situation and influenced the ignoring of the tragedy of Ukraine, but it was a complex combination of factors, and among this ideological factor was indeed important. And yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Zhou, if I'm, yeah, it's correct. Okay, thank you for the comments and for reading very carefully all our papers. So to your question about, you know, the protests, let's say the different forms of protesting or let's say reacting to the food shortages, which is a good point you said. Not every food shortages is becoming a famine. So it's a very, very interesting suggestions here. Why the earlier signals of the famine were not elevated, you know, were not dealt with by the regime, and it turned in a famine, both in the 30s and in the post-war years, in 46, 47. You asked about this protest, and then this is interesting because actually I'm working on a book on post-war famine, and actually when John asked me if I want to join this conference, I said I might have something from a chapter I'm developing for this book on the cross-border during the post-war famine, and I had a paragraph comparing the post-war cross-border phenomenon with the interwar one, with the Holodomor years. And it's interesting that you have a different, let's say, successions of events, yes, in the 30s and in the post-war famine, because actually the Holodomor years is connected to collectivization, while the post-war famine is not connected to collectivization. So you have different kind of phenomena and different, let's say, successions of events. You have Babi Bunte, for instance, in the post-war, before, on the early stages of the famine in spring 1946. And here in 1930s, you have the protest, including this mass protest by the women, dominated by the women, the majority of them. As in the Soviet Union, as in the Ola documents, yes, there were about 14,000 peasant rebellions, about 6,000, I think, only in Ukraine, and about at least 1/3 were dominated by women. So it's an interesting topic here, yes. And you suggested, yes, it's of course it is connected to the role of the women in the families. They were more sensitive. And here you said about the Irish famine. Actually, you have in the Irish famine the same interesting fact that women were more responsible during the famine years than the men. The men in the Irish famine, it's documented. You have a book on, I don't remember now the author, but I have it about women in the Irish famine, and you had the men going to spend their last penny in the bar. And the women were going, hoarding and, panicked and all this stuff. And they were very, so it's different response here. So it's interesting topic here to explain. And but I'll stop here. Just your question. There are at least 2 volumes of documents on the cross-border in the interwar, according to Romanian documents. So we have 2 collections of documents. One on Transnistrians. It's called Trecerea, blah blah blah. In the 30s in general, but specifically focus on the Holodomor years, and another book about the activity of the Ukrainian diaspora in the interwar Romania, and it's focused mainly around the leader. I don't remember now. I don't want to
to give you the wrong name, but there is a document, a volume of document as well. Both collections published by Vadim Guzun. Vadim Guzun is a Moldavian which lives in Romania. And the documents are basically from the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so we could be in contact and I'll give you exact titles. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we can take questions from the audience.
Thank you for some fascinating papers. So Matt Pauley, Michigan State University. So one question to Olena, informed by a reading of Kate Brown's excellent book, Biography of No Place, not surprisingly, I'm going to ask a question. Well, first a comment and then a question. So there's a fair amount about religion in Kate Brown's book. She focuses obviously, or maybe not so obviously, on evangelism. But there is certainly information on the role that Catholic priests played and Catholic village societies played in resisting the famine and protesting against collectivization. And then the question, of course, Kate argues that national identities shouldn't be presumed as necessarily fixed, right? Particularly during this time of the 1920s and 1930s. So at the same time, she argues that Ukrainians from the Zhytomyr region Poles used their cultural identities to petition Polish consulates for exit from Soviet Ukraine. So I'm, I guess, wondering if you have evidence of any people claiming Polish identity. It's a hard thing to discern, but the way in which people might have reimagined their national identity as a path towards potential rescue or salvation from the famine. And then just briefly to Igor, are populations crossing the border only from the transborder areas, from the populations that are alongside the border, or do we have evidence of populations traveling from elsewhere in Soviet Ukraine into Moldova to seek border crossing? And perhaps you have evidence of other transit lines as well. Thank you.
Would like to go first, Olena?
Yes, I can respond. I think these two questions are actually one from Wiktoria and another one from Matt. I can put them in one. It's a good question, the definition of Polish minority, and this is the one I asked myself when I started working on this project, and I was trying to understand who those people were behind the census of 1926. Those Poles, those 482,000, if I remember correctly, Poles. And then when you look at the documents on the ground, and you see that a lot of those people, they spoke the same language. The only difference might have been just that kind of those assumed Poles went to the Catholic Church, and those Ukrainians went to the Orthodox Church. But then obviously there was a problem of Ukrainian Catholics, and this was really a problem for the party officials, how to categorize them, whether they were Ukrainians, colonized Ukrainians, or kind of Russified Poles, and so on and so on. So this is a good question, but at the same time, because we have access to, or because we can use Soviet statistics, and Soviet statistics mattered in the way those people received access to education, to other state services. So they were basically the category, the census category, though, like those ascribed Poles or assumed Poles, they were later they were very easy to discern in terms of their relations to the state. And this is why perhaps this kind of, we can see how they, I mean, there is more information about the Marchlevsk in the sources, because this was a separate region with predominant Polish population, or 69%, I think, of them were Poles. So there is more statistics on that, and this is why they are easier to see in the sources. And obviously, those people who were recorded as Poles by the census, they lived everywhere across Ukraine, and they suffered perhaps more significantly in some regions in central Ukraine than in Marchlevsk. But this is just as one of the case studies, I chose that, and I don't say that other Poles did not suffer from or did not starve during that. And Matt, thank you for the comment on the role of religion. And as I said, I didn't really work on the famine itself. It has never been a focus of my study, so there is more to do and more to study, and I would definitely I think this is the role of religion is something very important to consider. Why basically how stable this category was, and whether people changed affiliation. I think this is also linked to this state promotion or state institutionalization of identity. And this, like the second half of the 1920s, everything was done through ethnic, well, I would say cadasters, but there were not necessarily cadasters, but those people who were labeled as Poles, they would be sent to Polish schools. They were expected to read Polish press and so on and so on. Once they were in this Polish village, Soviet or Marchlevsk, they were kind of expected to learn Polish, to use Polish, to communicate with the state in Polish. So I think there was some kind of already assumption that even if we speak a different language, we are, like, by the state, we are recognized as Poles. And later on, obviously, this kind of identity, which was very often brought from top down, was used during the famine, during the collectivization, and during the famine to petition the governments. Although those Poles who lived there for generations, they didn't really see themselves as part of the Polish state. And in the sources, I saw some mentioning that when people would say, yeah, Poles are those born in Poland, we are not Poles, we are Ukrainians. So there was more of a civic identity, although there was obviously a difference in those mixed communities, mainly kind of in religious terms. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. It's really hard to, like, kind of being online, it's really hard to see people and reactions. So
We've got two questions from Zoom, one from Irina Skubi, comment to Jan Jacek, Bruski. It seems that the Polish authorities did not want to be directly involved in the dissemination of the information of the famine, same as other countries, but instead they provided support for some Promethean organizations such as Ofinor to disseminate the information on the situation to the USSR and Ukraine. This comment is based on the research project with Rosa Alvarez-Klee, where we examine how Ofinor bulletins were disseminated in Spain. Question to Igor. Do the documents on border crossing reveal what material possessions the illegal migrants had? And just one more question to Igor from Maxim Snihur. What would be the sources on the shootings of the refugees by Romanian border guards? Were they the self-reports of the gendarmes, newspapers, or something else? And a small addition regarding the books. There is a volume on the documents published on the activities of Colonel Hnat Porochivsky in Romania. So, Igor, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, first of all, to the first question, on the origin of the territorial origin, let's say, of those who cross the border. I don't have exact data on that for the early 30s. I have more on the post-war famine, which was the initial focus of my research. But I'll search for that. For the post-war, I have data from the Ministry of Internal Affairs archive in Chișinău, which gives the territorial distributions of those who crossed the border in 46, 47 from the Moldovan SSR. And I have the data from GARF in Moscow. Luckily enough, I was there in due time, and the sum of 2019. I have the statistic for the whole Soviet Union in the post-war famine. And there you have exact official data of those who try to cross the Romanian-Soviet border, coming from Ukraine and even from Russia. It's interesting, they were attracted by I don't know, there were rumors, probably that it was the experience of many, that the easiest part to go to Romania was the present-day Ismail area, Danube Delta. I don't have yet, so as I said, that for the interwar, but according to this map, you know, this map is from 1932. It's also from Moscow, from GAIERF actually, not GARF, the Economical State Archive of Russian Federation. And I mentioned it has been discovered, let's say, by Andrei Schlechter, who last year defended his thesis, coordinated by Sheila Fitzpatrick at Chicago University. It's about smugglers in the interwar period. It's interesting for all of us, I think. And what else? Maxim Snihir asked about these are basically police reports. It's from the Minister of Interior, from this, which are held by. It's in the State Archives of Romania, the National Archives of Romania, and they are free. If he knows Romanian, if not, I could help a bit, not too much. Okay.
We have time just for one more question, because the last question is
a comment to Olena and Palko, and maybe a suggestion. The comment would be, I think, a word of caution in ethnicizing some of your, I think, at least preliminary conclusions. When it comes to collectivization, I don't know if that would apply. I think collectivization was the rate of collectivization and the pace of collectivization, I think, was more of an economic issue. If you look at the resolutions of that, or the directives that were issued in 1929, the south of Ukraine was to be collectivized first, and most of the efforts were to be placed there. And the reason why is because that's the grain producing region, and they wanted to get that done first. So when you look at the community, the ethnic communities that lived in the south, you have the Greeks, and then you also have some German communities in the Dnipropetrovsk area. So you want to test that ethnic thesis by looking at whether the Greeks were collectivized sooner, and I believe you said that the rate of collectivization was quite high in their community. And then also you would want to look at the German communities in the Dnipropetrovsk area. So the Bolsheviks weren't that interested in collectivizing right away in the north or in the right bank of Ukraine. So that's the word of caution that I would offer there. And I would tend to use more the term national when you're talking about Ukraine as a whole, as opposed to Ukraine as an ethnic entity, because Ukraine is multi-ethnic. The Ukrainian ethnos is most important within those communities of ethnoses. But when we look at the policies of the Soviet state, It's aimed at Ukraine as a republic or as a territorial administrative unit. So when the plans come down for instance, grain collections, it goes to the republic first, and then it's apportioned to the oblast, and then they go down to the rayon level. That's where you might have some sort of an ethnic factor come into play.
Just to continue our discussion with the lunch. The restaurant will be closed at 2 o'clock, so I would invite everyone to make their way to the garden restaurant and continue discussion there. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, our panelists and our discussant and the audience.